Hello and welcome. This is Jennifer. I'm glad you're here. Today I am sharing some ideas for simple partial die cutting. Now, partial die cutting seems a little intimidating, but I promise it's something that's easy to do and is a great way to get different looks from dies that you may have. I have 3 examples for you today. This is a shorter video for me, but I did share some other ideas for partial die cut sentiments in my previous video, which I'll link to here on the top right and at the end of this video. Today, we're using different types of dies to create new looks. Let's get started with this example. I am using the Simon Says Stamp CZ Design Winter Village die set. This has several small dies in it, and I thought I would do a partial die cut border with them. This will demonstrate that partial die cutting can be done with even small dies and multiple dies. In fact, I've done partial die cut edge cards in the past. I'll link to that video at the end and up here on the top right if you want to check it out. Okay, so what I have here is a piece of cardstock that's the same size as the card I plan to make, which is 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. I'm holding a piece of Altenew satin tape, which is just a temporary sticky tape, so that it's sticky side facing up. Onto that, I am laying my dies, spacing them out how I want them to be on the bottom of my card. Now keep in mind this is reverse of how it will die cut, but this will help me with the spacing. Once I'm happy with the placement, I can pick up that tape, flip it over, and place it along the bottom of this card panel. Again, this card panel is 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. I'm using an 80-pound white cardstock, but you could use whatever you may have. The reason I chose slightly lighter weight was so I could be sure this die cut nicely. Okay, I'm using my Griffin Empress die cut machine, but you could use whatever die cut machine you have. Lay your cardstock and your dies onto the bottom cutting plate, and then the top cutting plate, you're going to cover most of the dies, but leave the bottom edge of those dies hanging out. The portion hanging out there will not cut. You can see I just have like maybe 1/8 of an inch of those dies hanging out the bottom of that cutting plate. If your cutting plate has a beveled edge, this will still work. Okay, now I ran that through my die cut machine and we have this partial die cut piece. Now we need to cut off the rest of it. So we're cutting the sky away. To do this, I need to cut between each of these elements. So from the tree to the house to the church, and so on, cutting right across there, but keeping each element connected to that white border along the bottom. Now at this point, I didn't think I could do this with my shoulder, so I asked my husband to come in and do this for me. His head gets in the way of the camera, so I edited a little bit of it out, but it will give you the idea. He's going to take a straight edge and line up the straight edge where the bottom of all of those houses and trees stop, where the die cutting stops. And he's going to use a craft knife to cut along that straight edge between each of those elements, so between the house and the church and the trees. Then you can carefully pull the sky away. Now, if you're not good with a craft knife, you could also use little scissors to get in there and cut that, but a craft knife will definitely give you the most exact results. So now he's carefully pulling this away, and we have a partial die cut border. Now, you definitely could have just glued those individual die cuts along a white border, but this continuous element gives a really cool look and really stands out against a simple card design. So off screen, we did another one of those. You can see it's up there on the top left. That time we left more of a white panel below it, not just a little white border, but I did it in the exact same way. Now I want to add dimension behind these. You could definitely use little foam tape or foam squares, but what I decided to do instead was die cut 3 of each of the elements and glue them to the back of that partial die cut piece. So here I glued 3 white church die cuts together, and I'm gluing on the back of the partial die cut piece. And I'll do that for the 2 houses and the 2 trees also. This will give it nice raised dimension that will stand up nicely when it goes through the mail. Now I also will add some dimension behind that solid border part of the partial die cut piece, but I'm going to wait because I might trim it shorter. Let's first do our background. Now the background on our first card, I started with some bold blue cardstock, and I'm using my Altenew blending brush and some Hero Arts Indigo core ink to put a little bit of darker color around the edges. Now I'm doing this left-handed because I can't do ink blending with my right shoulder. So you'll see I'm kind of struggling my way through it. I'm not very good at blending with my left hand, but it really doesn't matter. This goes to show you your blending doesn't need to look perfect. It will kind of dry on its own and it'll work out just fine, especially because I'm going to do some stamping on top of this. So I just put a little bit of darker color around the edges of the top portion of this card. Next, I thought I'd do some stamping with that same color of ink, and I've got this background stamp called Christmas Words from Simon Says Stamp. This is one of my favorite holiday stamps this season, and I'm going to stamp with that indigo ink. I have my MISTI stamping tool with this sticky mat inside. I'm going to line up my paper so it's straight, then close the MISTI upside down, and the sticky mat will grab that cardstock and hold it there while we stamp on it, and I can be sure that it is straight. Now, when I stamp this, you'll be able to see that stamping, and I'll stamp it 2 or 3 times to make it a bit darker, just so that I can see it even better on that dark blue background. However, keep in mind, a lot of inks kind of soften as they dry, so this will lighten a bit. So at this point, I thought I could either switch to a darker blue so it stands out more, but then I changed my mind and decided to do some white stamping on top, but offset it a bit. So here's what we have so far. This will lighten a bit. I'm going to clean that stamp, and I'm using Hero Art's Ultra Clean and a Hero Art scrubber, my favorite way to clean stamps. I just scrub that clean and then just use a dry cloth to clean it off. By the way, the scrubbing portion of that block comes off so you can rinse it out and clean it. Every once in a while, I do that maybe once a month to clean it out. All right, now I've shifted that cardstock over to a different part of the stamp. So we'll do some offset stamping here. And this time I'm stamping with white pigment ink. This is Hero Art's Unicorn White Pigment ink, but use whatever white pigment ink you may have. Mine needs re-inking, so I'm going to double stamp it just to make it stand out even more. Now we have this background stamp stamped twice, once with dark blue ink and once with the white. And that white will definitely stand out better, which I think is fun for this particular card design. Okay, so now we need to glue these elements together. I did heat set that white pigment ink, by the way, so it won't smear. Now remember, I still need some dimension behind that white border along the bottom of our partial die cut piece. So I die cut 3 white scraps that are slightly smaller than that border. I'll glue those together and then glue that on the back of our partial die cut panel. So now all the tree and house elements have dimension and the border has dimension, so it'll stand up nicely against our background and hold up through the mail nicely. Now you could definitely use foam there again if you prefer. So now I'll put glue on the back of all of this and glue it to the bottom of our 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch panel background. That will get glued to a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch white note card a little bit later. All right, first sentiment on this, I wanted something bold and simple along that white border. So I'm using the Simon Says Stamp 6x8 stamp set. This has some really cool tree elements in it that you could use for holiday trees or stamp repeatedly to create a pattern all year round. I chose Joy and Peace, and I'm stamping that with black ink, keeping it very simple. So here is the completed card. I did add some sequins to the background. These are star-shaped sequins from Trinity Stamps, and they're iridescent. So you can see how when you tilt it in the light, it really sparkles. So now you can get a closer look of that connected panel on the bottom, the white part. Because of partial die cutting, it looks like it was a die that cuts this shape, but really we used individual dies and partial die cutting to create it. Now remember earlier I also showed you another partial die cut panel that I created in the same exact way. However, I left the bottom solid portion taller, and I thought I'd show you how I finished that card off. Now for that background, I wanted to do some inlay die cutting, and I thought I'd use like different shades of the same color. Whenever I want like a light, medium, and dark of the same color, I use memory box paper pads. I forget to mention them in videos, and I thought I would do so again today. I really like these color pads. There are different color collections. This is the Ocean and Purple or Ocean and Blue paper pad. In here are 48 sheets, 6x6. They're white core and color on both sides. Great when you want to find colors that match really nicely together. So off screen, I chose 4 colors from this pad, and I die cut with this Simon Says Stamp background die. And you can see I have the light, medium, dark, and extra dark all along the top of the screen there from that memory box paper pad. Now below on the bottom of the screen, I have a piece of white cardstock that is 4¼ by 5½ inches, and I've covered it with Altenew double-sided tape. Now I folded back the release paper so that I can add these die cuts to the top portion, and then I can lay the release paper back down to press those die cuts into place. I'm starting with the darkest color and that frame die cut and then building the other die cuts around it. This is very easy to do because I can press it into that Altenew double-sided adhesive, which doesn't really hold tightly until you press it down. So you can have some time to kind of move it around, see how I kind of lift it and get it just where I want it. Once I have all the pieces in place, I'll use a bone folder to really press them down and then they'll stay put. So having a double-sided adhesive like this is really helpful when doing die cut inlay like this. Now remember, I cut that background 4 times from 4 different shades, so I can actually put 4 backgrounds together. I'm just doing 1 in this video. Now, after I have all the pieces in place, I can trim off the excess. Notice this didn't cover the bottom of my white panel. That's because I did this sideways. I did the die cut inlay sideways. If I wanted to cover the whole thing, I would have done it in the other direction. Okay, so now I have that panel, and just that top portion is going to stick out from the top of our partial die cut panel. I did put additional die cut pieces on the back of our partial die cut panel because I wanted that extra dimension. I did it just like I showed you before. Now, I could have done my die cut inlay directly on a note card, but I didn't think of it at the time, which is actually good because I ended up trimming a little bit off the top. So I glued my die cut inlay background onto a 4¼ by 5½ inch white note card, and then the partial die cut panel on top. So that die I think is such a cool background die, and here I just use it peeking out as the sky on this card. Once again, I used those same iridescent stars from Trinity Stamps to add some sparkle to the sky. I really like how that catches the light and adds some interest to this simple card design. So this card shows you can do your partial die cutting anywhere on your card panel. You could even do it at an angle if you want to add even more interest to your card. Okay, let's move on to another example. This time I'm using a large leaf die to do the partial die cutting. So with my first 2 examples, we use small dies. Here we're using a large intricate die. So I have the new Simon Says Stamp Lovely Leaves die. I love this because it fills a card panel so nicely. I'm placing on a piece of white cardstock that's 4¼ by 5½ inches. I put that all on my bottom cutting plate. The top cutting plate I'm offsetting so it only covers like the top 2/3 of that die. Anything hanging out will not die cut. Anything under that top cutting plate will. So this will give us a partial die cut panel. Without letting those plates move, I'll run that through my die cut machine. You should be able to do partial die cutting with whatever machine you have. You just want to be careful. It's not really how you're supposed to use your cutting plates, but I've never had a problem. Okay, so now here I'm just kind of cutting away some of that extra die cut material so I can easier see where I need to do my craft knife cutting. Now this time I will use a T-ruler and a pencil to draw a line where I need to cut. I'm drawing this pencil line between the die cutting. So from the edge of the cardstock right to where the die cutting starts, then between the stems of the leaves, and then to the edge of the card. And I'm using a pencil to do that just so you can kind of better see where I will be cutting. I then have my cutting board, a straight edge, and a sharp craft knife. And I'm just going to cut between the die cutting, right there at the bottom of where the die cutting stops. Now, I am not great with a craft knife, especially when I have a bum shoulder like this. It doesn't really matter. You can just do most of the cutting with the craft knife and then finish off the little nooks and crannies with scissors, which you'll see me do. Another option here is to do all of this with scissors, or you can use a trimmer like the Fiskars trimmer where you can drop the blade at the middle and then just do a little bit of cutting and then lift the blade. It just depends on the trimmer that you may have. So here I did most of the cutting with my craft knife, but you'll see me come in with those scissors to finish things off. Now, if you have like rough edges, you can just use a bone folder, kind of smooth those edges off, and it'll look like you die cut your panel like this, when really you used an individual leaf die and partial die cutting to get this unique look. Okay, so now I need to add some dimension behind this. So I off screen die cut 3 of the same leaf die, and I glued that together. That's the piece that you see on the left. I'm putting strong liquid adhesive on the back of our partial die cut piece, and then I'll put the stacked die cut onto it. This will give it some raised dimension that'll hold up nicely in the mail. By the way, if you don't want to stack 3 die cuts, you could instead cut from craft foam and use that for the dimension. I'm using Gina K Connect liquid adhesive in a fine tip bottle because I know that will hold well and also give me some wiggle room as I line these die cuts up. Now I can trim the excess off the bottom here, those bottom little stems, because I want some solid cardstock on the back of that portion of the partial die cut piece so it stands up nicely too. By the way, another reason I like to use cardstock for dimension is because I can use scraps. Usually I cut up like panels that I messed up my stamping or stenciling and use those for dimension. Sometimes I use inexpensive white cardstock if I've run out of scraps, but you could even use packaging for this. Now for a sentiment on this card, I used the Simon Says Stamp Thankful and Grateful stamp set. There are dies available, but I don't use them today. I did use them in my last video if you want to check that out. I actually did partial die cutting with this sentiment. So I have my MISTI stamping tool, and inside of that I have my Waffle flower grip mat that will hold my partial die cut piece in place as I stamp on it. This is the Thankful stamp that I'm stamping with black ink. After I've stamped that, right above it I will stamp a small sub-sentiment that's also from the same stamp set. And because we did partial die cutting, we have that perfect area along the bottom for this sentiment. Now for the background, I thought I'd do some die cutting, just tone-on-tone die cutting. I used the Simon Says Stamp Bubble Burst background die. You can see it on the left there. I cut that from mist color cardstock, and I glued it on a mist colored solid piece, just for a tone-on-tone look. By the way, there is a smaller die available that coordinates with that background die, so you can cut these little outline pieces to line up. You can create a layered background with this. I didn't use those dies today, I just did the background panel. I thought it looked really cool tone on tone. Now onto this, I will glue our partial die cut piece. Remember, we have that layering in the background, so it'll stand up with some nice strong dimension. Next, I'm adding a bird that I created with the Simon Says Stamp Berry Bird dies. You can see the set over on the left. I created it from some scraps of teal color cardstock and used a black gem for the eye. Around it, I will add some silver glitter berries that I made from that die set. And that's all I added to this. I felt like there was enough interest with the texture on the background, the partial die cutting, and that little touch of glitter paper. Here's a closer look at the completed card. You can see how cool that partial die cutting looks there with that continuous white die cut panel, the texture that we added to the background, and then our cute little bird on top. So this shows you can use large intricate dies for partial die cutting. The first 2 examples show you can use small dies. Really, you can use any dies that you may have to create a new look. It's a great way to stretch your supplies and use them creatively. If you're interested in the supplies I used, I have them linked below in my YouTube description. But more importantly, here at the end, I'll link to the video I did yesterday that shows simple partial die cutting with word dies. And the second video shows how to do partial die cutting with coordinating dies for stamped images. I think you'll like that one too. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon.